The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the immaculate lawns of Whitmore House, where the annual summer fete had drawn nearly every resident of St. Mary Mead to its perfectly manicured grounds. White canvas marquees dotted the emerald grass like elegant ships at anchor, each housing tables laden with homemade preserves, embroidered linens, and the charitable offerings that formed the backbone of English village life. The air carried the mingled scents of freshly cut grass, prize-winning roses, and Mrs. Price Ridley's famous Victoria sponge, which had dominated the baking competition for 3 consecutive years and showed no signs of surrendering its crown. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the dappled shade of an ancient oak, her knitting needles moving with the practiced efficiency of decades. She was working on what would eventually become a cardigan for her nephew Raymond, though her pale blue eyes were not focused on the soft grey wool, but rather on the fascinating tableau of human nature unfolding before her. To the casual observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a harmless, elderly spinster enjoying a pleasant afternoon's entertainment. Those who knew Miss Marple better understood that very little escaped her notice, and that she found the study of her fellow creatures to be the most absorbing occupation in the world. The manor itself stood as a testament to Georgian elegance, its honey-colored stone facade gleaming warmly in the late afternoon light. It had belonged to the Whitmore family for 6 generations, though the current baronet, Sir Julian Whitmore, had inherited the estate only 18 months earlier, following his father's death. Julian had wasted little time in making his mark upon both house and grounds, much to the mixed feelings of the villagers who preferred their traditions undisturbed. He had modernized the plumbing, installed electric lighting throughout the principal rooms, and, most controversially, married Lady Isabella Fortescue, whose brief career on the London stage had provided the village gossips with enough material to last several seasons. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily as she observed Sir Julian himself moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man born to command. He was handsome in the conventional English manner, tall and lean, with dark hair beginning to show distinguished threads of silver at the temples. His smile revealed excellent teeth and seemed genuine enough, though Miss Marple detected a certain tension around his eyes that spoke of recent worries. Money troubles, perhaps, or the strain of maintaining such a large establishment in these uncertain times. "More tea, Miss Marple?" The voice belonged to Miss Dorothy Bantry, Colonel Bantry's daughter, who had appointed herself an unofficial hostess for the afternoon despite having no actual connection to Whitmore House. Dolly was 24, pretty in a wholesome English rose manner, with honey-blonde hair and cheeks that flushed easily with emotion. She held a silver teapot with the kind of determined cheerfulness that suggested she was working very hard to appear unconcerned about something. "How very thoughtful, my dear," Miss Marple replied, extending her delicate china cup. "Such a lovely afternoon for the fete, though I couldn't help but notice you seem a trifle distracted. Is everything quite all right?" Dolly's color deepened perceptibly, and she glanced toward the house where Sir Julian had just disappeared through the French windows leading to the library. "Oh, perfectly fine, Miss Marple. Perhaps just a touch warm, that's all. I think I might take a turn around the rose garden presently." Miss Marple made a small, understanding sound and returned to her knitting, though her sharp eyes followed Dolly's retreating figure with interest. The girl was transparently in love with Julian Whitmore, a fact that seemed obvious to everyone except perhaps the baronet himself, who appeared to regard Dolly with the same benevolent indifference he might show a favorite spaniel. It was a common enough situation, Miss Marple reflected, and usually ended in tears or a hasty engagement to someone entirely unsuitable. The afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm characteristic of such village gatherings. Lady Isabella moved among her guests with practiced grace, her pale blue dress managing to be both fashionable and appropriate for a country garden party. She had that particular talent possessed by former actresses for making each person feel they were receiving her complete attention, though Miss Marple noticed that her ladyship's eyes frequently sought out a particular figure near the refreshment tent. This was Mr. Leonard Carstairs, Sir Julian's London solicitor, a dark-suited man of perhaps 40, whose presence at a village fete seemed somewhat incongruous. He possessed the narrow, intelligent face of a man accustomed to dealing with other people's secrets, and his eyes held the perpetual wariness of someone who trusted very little to chance. Miss Marple had observed him earlier in earnest conversation with Sir Julian, their heads bent together over what appeared to be legal documents, their expressions grave. Near the Skittles competition, she noticed another figure who seemed oddly out of place. Miss Lavinia Price, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s who had moved to St. Mary Mead only 6 months earlier. Miss Price had immediately set about inserting herself into every aspect of village life with an enthusiasm that bordered on aggression, and she was currently engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Haydock about what appeared to be her various ailments. The good doctor wore the patient but slightly desperate expression of a man who had been cornered by a determined hypochondriac. "Dreadful woman," murmured Mrs. Bantry, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with a sigh of relief. "She's been interrogating poor Dr. Haydock for the better part of an hour. And did you hear what she said to Mrs. Price Ridley about the church flowers? Suggested they were old-fashioned and that she could provide a more contemporary aesthetic for Sunday services. I thought Mrs. Price Ridley might have apoplexy on the spot." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "Miss Price does seem rather determined to establish herself in the village, though one must make allowances for newcomers trying to find their place in an established community." "Mark my words, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said darkly. "That woman is after something. I've seen her watching this house like a hawk watches a particularly fat mouse, and she's been positively fawning over Sir Julian ever since she arrived, though heaven knows he doesn't seem to notice." Before Miss Marple could respond, a disturbance near the house caught their attention. The French windows to the library had opened, and a young man emerged with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested something was amiss without quite descending into panic. He was perhaps 28, with a pale complexion and ink-stained fingers that marked him as one of the artistic types who rented rooms in the village. This was Mr. Raymond Ashford, who had taken lodgings at the vicarage and was rumoured to be writing a novel about the moral decline of the upper classes. Mr. Ashford's eyes swept the crowd until they found Dr. Haydock, whom he approached with evident purpose. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could observe the change that came over the doctor's expression as the young man bent to whisper in his ear, the professional mask of calm settling over features that had, just moments before, registered surprise and concern. The two men moved toward the house together, their departure noted by several guests but not yet causing any general alarm. Miss Marple, however, set down her knitting with a small, decisive movement. "I believe," she said quietly to Mrs. Bantry, "that something rather unfortunate has occurred." Mrs. Bantry looked at her friend with a mixture of exasperation and respect that came from decades of acquaintance. "Jane Marple, how on earth could you possibly know that? They might be discussing anything, a headache, a turned ankle, any number of perfectly ordinary things." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she thought otherwise. "But did you notice Mr. Ashford's shoes, my dear? They were quite muddy, despite the fact that all the pathways here are either gravelled or paved. And Dr. Haydock touched his medical bag before they went inside, not the action of a man expecting to deal with something minor. Also, Mr. Ashford looked back at the crowd in a very particular way as he crossed the lawn. It reminded me strongly of young Tommy Miller when he came to tell me that someone had broken into the church vestry. The expression of a person who has discovered something they very much wish they had not." The two women sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the cheerful sounds of the garden party continuing around them with oblivious normalcy. Then, quite suddenly, a scream pierced the afternoon air, high, sharp, and unmistakably genuine in its horror. It came from inside Whitmore House. The effect on the garden party was instantaneous and electric. Conversations ceased mid-sentence, teacups froze halfway to lips, and every head turned toward the manor. For a heartbeat, the entire gathering seemed suspended in a tableau of shocked surprise. Then, as though released from a spell, people began moving toward the house in a confused rush, their voices rising in questions and speculation. Miss Marple rose from her chair with surprising agility for a woman of her years. As she and Mrs. Bantry made their way through the increasingly agitated crowd, she noticed something that others had missed in their haste. There, on the flagstone terrace outside the library's French windows, were two sets of footprints in what appeared to be damp earth from the flower beds. The curious thing was not that the footprints existed, but rather their direction. Instead of pointing toward the gardens where the guests had been gathered, both sets led away from the house, toward the servants' entrance at the side of the building. Moreover, one set appeared to be considerably lighter than the other, almost as though someone had been walking on tiptoe, trying to make as little sound as possible. By the time they reached the French doors, Sir Julian had emerged, his face pale and his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Behind him stood Mr. Carstairs, the solicitor, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested professional training in concealing shock. "Please," Sir Julian said, his voice unsteady. "Everyone must remain calm. There has been, that is to say, Dr. Haydock has requested that no one enter the house for the moment. If you could all please return to the gardens." But his words were lost in the rising tide of questions and concerns. It was Dolly Bantry who managed to push close enough to ask, her voice sharp with barely controlled panic. "Julian, what's happened? Who screamed?" Sir Julian's eyes found Dolly's, and for a moment, genuine emotion flickered across his features. Something that might have been fear or grief, or perhaps a mixture of both. "It's Miss Price," he said quietly. "Lavinia Price. I'm afraid she's dead." The words fell into the crowd like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that spread outward in ever-widening circles. Dead? How could anyone be dead on such a perfect summer afternoon at a garden party in St. Mary Mead, where the most exciting events were usually confined to disputed judging at the flower show? Miss Marple stood very still, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. Sir Julian's hands were trembling slightly as he attempted to maintain order among his guests. Mr. Ashford had reappeared in the doorway behind him, his face set in an expression of studied neutrality that struck Miss Marple as distinctly odd for someone who had just discovered, or helped to discover, a dead body. And there, just visible through the French windows, was Dr. Haydock, speaking urgently into the telephone, no doubt summoning the police from Much Benham. How did she die? The question came from Colonel Bantry, who had pushed his way to the front of the crowd with the authority of a man accustomed to command in crisis situations. Sir Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again, seeming uncertain how to respond. It was Mr. Ashford who answered, his voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone. "She fell," he said simply, "from the gallery in the library. Her neck was broken." A collective gasp ran through the assembled guests, followed by a renewed surge of questions and speculation, but Miss Marple was no longer listening to the general commotion. Her attention had been caught by something else entirely, those mysterious footprints on the terrace and the peculiar fact that, according to what she had just heard, no one should have been walking away from the house at all. The peaceful summer afternoon had been shattered, and Miss Marple suspected that before this matter was properly resolved, many carefully guarded secrets would be dragged into the unforgiving light of day. She thought of those light, careful footsteps leading away from the scene, and of the expression on Mr. Ashford's face when he had emerged to summon the doctor. In her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that the details which seemed most insignificant at the moment of discovery were often the most revealing in the end. And these footsteps, the footsteps that no one should have heard, made by someone who had not wished to be detected, were going to prove very significant indeed. The police arrived from Much Benham with commendable swiftness, though their presence transformed the elegant afternoon into something resembling a military operation. Inspector Slack, a heavy-set man whose aggressive efficiency suggested he had already formed his conclusions, took command with the kind of authority that brooked no interference. His younger subordinate, Sergeant Lake, moved through the dispersing guests with methodical care, taking names and initial statements while the inspector himself disappeared into the house with Sir Julian. Miss Marple did not attempt to press nearer the doorway as several others did. Years of observation had taught her that initial confusion usually revealed more than any amount of direct questioning. Instead, she positioned herself on a stone bench near the rose garden, ostensibly to rest, but actually to observe the reactions of those around her. Mrs. Bantry remained at her side, partly from genuine concern and partly from undisguised curiosity about what would unfold. "Can't imagine how such a thing could happen," muttered Colonel Bantry, joining them after giving his statement. "The gallery railing in that library is solid oak, been there for 200 years, not the sort of thing that simply gives way." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm. Perhaps Miss Price leaned too far over while examining something below, though I did notice she was wearing quite sensible brogues, not the sort of footwear prone to slipping on polished floors. From their vantage point, they could observe the house where Inspector Slack's voice occasionally rose in what sounded more like interrogation than polite inquiry. Mr. Ashford stood before him with defensive posture, his hands clasped behind his back, answering questions in tones too low to carry. Lady Isabella remained nearby, her earlier poise replaced by brittle tension as she twisted her pearl necklace between nervous fingers. "The inspector seems particularly interested in Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple observed mildly, though whether that indicates suspicion or merely the natural desire to question the discoverer of the body, one cannot yet determine. "Surely he can't suspect that young man," protested Dolly, who had approached with unwanted tea. "Though there was that unfortunate incident at the post office last week. Miss Hartnell mentioned she heard Mr. Ashford call Miss Price a venomous old harpy and say she was ruining everything." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "Ruining everything? How very interesting. I wonder what he meant by that." The conversation was interrupted by the emergence of Dr. Haydock from the house, his expression grave as he spoke quietly with Sergeant Lake. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could observe the change in the policeman's demeanor, the heightened alertness that suggested new and significant information. "I couldn't help but notice," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Miss Price seemed to take every opportunity to speak with Sir Julian when he was in residence. And there was that rather pointed remark she made at the church bazaar about old scandals and how the past catches up with people who imagine themselves safe from consequences." "What sort of scandals?" Colonel Bantry asked sharply. "Nothing terribly specific," Miss Marple replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Though Mrs. Price Ridley mentioned she seemed quite triumphant about something recently. Triumph can be a dangerous emotion. It often makes one careless." A young constable emerged from the house and approached Inspector Slack with obvious urgency. Their brief, intense conversation was followed by the inspector's sharp whistle, summoning additional officers. The atmosphere among the remaining guests grew noticeably more tense as it became clear this was no longer being treated as a simple accident. Miss Marple's attention was caught by movement near the terrace. The housemaid was industriously scrubbing at the flagstones where those mysterious footprints had been visible earlier, the light, careful steps leading away from the library toward the servants' entrance. "Prudence is all very well," Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Bantry, "but sometimes it becomes positively inconvenient when evidence is cleaned away so thoroughly." Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze and caught her breath. "You think those footprints were important?" "I have noticed that things people hurry to erase are often worth examining," Miss Marple said, "particularly when the mud appears to be the reddish clay found in rose gardens rather than the darker earth of the main lawns." As if summoned by her words, Inspector Slack emerged from the house with a grim expression. He approached the assembled villagers with the air of a man whose simple accident had become considerably more complicated. "There'll be an inquest, naturally," he announced, "but I'm afraid we're now treating this as a case of deliberate murder." The gallery railing was sawed through and carefully concealed with putty and varnish. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the remaining guests. Murder. In St. Mary Mead. At a garden party. Miss Marple continued her knitting, though her pale blue eyes were busy cataloguing every reaction, every nervous gesture, every telling glance exchanged between the suspects who stood before her in the lengthening shadows of what had begun as such a perfect summer afternoon. The declaration of murder worked upon St. Mary Mead like yeast in warm dough, expanding the village's capacity for speculation beyond all reasonable bounds. By evening, 3 distinct theories were circulating with equal conviction: that Miss Price had been blackmailing someone, that she had discovered a family scandal, or that her death was connected to some mysterious business involving London solicitors and forged documents. Miss Marple, who understood that initial confusion often revealed more than subsequent clarity, positioned herself strategically the following morning in her cottage garden. From there, she could observe the comings and goings at the Blue Boar Inn, where Mr. Carstairs had taken rooms rather than returning to London as expected. The solicitor's decision to remain in the village struck her as significant. Men of his profession rarely lingered where their services were no longer required, unless compelled by circumstances beyond their control. Her vigil was rewarded when Inspector Slack arrived at her door, his expression suggesting he found the visit distasteful but necessary. Previous experience had taught him that Miss Marple possessed an uncomfortable talent for observation, though he would sooner walk barefoot across hot coals than admit it. "Just routine questions, Miss Marple," he said, settling into her delicate sitting-room chair with audible protest from the furniture. "You were present from the beginning yesterday, I understand." "Indeed, Inspector. I arrived shortly after 3 and remained beneath the oak tree until that dreadful scream. An excellent vantage point for observing the various activities." Her knitting needles moved with practiced efficiency as she spoke. "And Miss Price, did you observe her movements particularly?" "Oh yes, quite impossible to miss. She spent considerable time with Dr. Haydock discussing her ailments, then had rather an intense conversation with Mr. Carstairs. The solicitor seemed distinctly uncomfortable, kept glancing toward Sir Julian as though seeking rescue. This would have been shortly before 4 o'clock, just after Mrs. Price Ridley's baking triumph was announced. Inspector Slack made careful notes. And after that, Miss Price appeared quite agitated and moved toward the house with evident purpose. 4:15, I should estimate. Miss Marple paused thoughtfully. "I did notice something rather curious when we all rushed to the house afterward. Those footprints on the terrace, one set quite ordinary, but the other remarkably light, as though someone had been walking on tiptoe. The mud was that distinctive reddish clay from the rose garden beds, freshly turned that morning." The inspector's expression suggested irritation rather than interest. Household staff used that entrance regularly. Nothing suspicious about footprints. "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though one does wonder why anyone would be leaving the library at that particular moment rather than rushing toward it like everyone else. After Slack departed, Miss Marple made her way to the post office, timing her arrival to coincide with Mr. Carstairs' hasty exit. She noticed him sealing a large envelope addressed to private investigators in London, his usual professional courtesy forgotten in his obvious distress. Inside, Mrs. Price Ridley was holding court among the stationery supplies. "I always said there was something odd about that woman," she declared to Miss Hartnell. "Now it turns out she wasn't who she claimed to be at all. The police found papers suggesting her name wasn't Price in the first place." This revelation struck Miss Marple as highly significant. False identities suggested either shame about the past or deliberate deception for gain, both powerful motives for murder. Later, the vicar brought disturbing news. The police found a saw among young Ashford's painting supplies. He insists he's never seen it before, claims someone planted it during yesterday's confusion. How very convenient for Inspector Slack, Miss Marple observed. Almost too convenient. Sawing through gallery railings requires planning and intimate knowledge of the house's construction. That afternoon, tea with Dolly Bantry revealed another troubling development. "Julian's been acting so strangely," Dolly confided. "He's locked himself in the study and refuses to see anyone except Carstairs. This morning I saw him burning papers in the grate, old parchment documents that looked like legal papers." Miss Marple accepted this information with the gravity it deserved. Burnt papers tell no tales, but the act of burning them speaks volumes. If Sir Julian is destroying documents, he's clearly afraid of something coming to light. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. A false identity, planted evidence, destroyed documents, and those peculiar footprints. One set careful and deliberate, the other ordinary. The case pointed so neatly toward young Ashford that she found herself deeply suspicious of its very neatness. In her experience, the most obvious solution was often the most deceptive. Those light, careful steps leading away from the scene belonged not to an angry young man fleeing a crime, but to someone methodical and cautious, someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. Someone, she suspected, who knew Whitmore House very well indeed. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Miss Price had been living under a false name, making inquiries about the Whitmore family and apparently blackmailing someone with information she had discovered. Her murder had been carefully planned and expertly executed, with evidence planted to incriminate an innocent man. But the killer had made one crucial error. Those telltale footprints in the rose garden clay, hastily washed away, but not before Miss Marple had observed their significance. In her long experience, it was always the small, overlooked details that ultimately revealed the truth. The inquest convened 3 days later in the village hall, transforming that cheerful space into something resembling a judicial proceeding. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically in the third row, where she could observe not only the witnesses, but also the reactions of those who had gathered to hear the evidence. The coroner, a precise man from Much Benham, conducted the proceedings with methodical thoroughness that would have been admirable under different circumstances. Dr. Haydock testified first, describing with clinical detachment the broken neck that had caused Miss Price's death. The fall from the gallery, approximately 15 feet above the library floor, would have been instantly fatal. Time of death was established between 4:15 and 4:30, during the height of the garden party, when most guests were occupied with the outdoor festivities. The carpenter's testimony proved most damaging to any theory of accident. He confirmed that the gallery railing had been deliberately weakened with a fine saw, the cuts concealed so expertly with wood stain and putty that only close examination revealed the sabotage. "Weeks of work, sir," he concluded gravely. "Whoever did this knew their tools and had intimate knowledge of the house's construction. This weren't no spur-of-the-moment crime." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she absorbed this crucial detail. Weeks of preparation suggested not passionate anger, but cold, calculated planning. Someone had been preparing for Miss Price's death long before the garden party provided the perfect opportunity. Raymond Ashford took the stand with visible reluctance, his earlier artistic confidence replaced by defensive anxiety. He described entering the house ostensibly to use the facilities, then discovering Miss Price's body sprawled on the Turkish carpet below the gallery. His immediate summons of Dr. Haydock appeared entirely proper, yet Inspector Slack's questioning revealed troubling inconsistencies in his timeline. "You stated you were sketching in the rose garden at 4 o'clock, Slack pressed, "yet multiple witnesses place you near the terrace doors at that precise time." "I may have been mistaken about the exact moment," Ashford replied, his composure cracking slightly. "The afternoon's events have become rather muddled in my memory." The discovery of the saw among his painting supplies remained the most damaging evidence, despite his protestations that someone had planted it there during the confusion following the murder. Miss Marple noted that his denial sounded increasingly desperate rather than convincing. Sir Julian's testimony revealed unexpected depths of distress beneath his usual composed exterior. When questioned about his relationship with the deceased, he admitted that Miss Price had approached him repeatedly regarding family genealogy, claiming to research local history for a book she was supposedly writing. "She seemed particularly interested in records from my grandfather's generation," he said, his voice strained. "Her inquiry struck me as rather intrusive, and I discouraged further contact. Yet she persisted in attending functions at your home? One cannot exclude guests from a village fete, Inspector, though I confess her presence had become increasingly uncomfortable." Miss Marple observed Lady Isabella throughout her husband's testimony, noting how she twisted her wedding ring with nervous intensity. When called to testify herself, Lady Isabella confirmed that Miss Price had spoken to her at the garden party, though she claimed their conversation concerned nothing more significant than the refreshments and weather. The careful omissions in her testimony suggested matters left deliberately unspoken. Mr. Carstairs proved the most enigmatic witness. Initially claiming professional privilege, he reluctantly admitted that Miss Price had made inquiries about property law and inheritance rights. "Nothing specific," he insisted, "merely hypothetical questions about entailed estates and the legitimacy of claims." After the trial, proceedings concluded with a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Dr. Haydock, who seemed troubled despite the formal conclusion. "Something bothering you, Doctor?" she inquired gently. "The whole business feels wrong, Miss Marple. Young Ashford may be temperamental, but cold-blooded murder seems beyond his character, and that saw was brand new, purchased from Mullin's shop just 2 days before the crime. What killer leaves such traceable evidence?" "A foolish one," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. "Or perhaps someone being framed by a very clever individual. Tell me, Doctor, when you examined Miss Price's body, did you notice anything unusual about her hands?" Haydock paused, considering carefully. "Now that you mention it, there were traces of furniture polish under her fingernails. I assumed she had been examining the library woodwork for some reason. Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "she had been searching for something concealed within the furniture itself. Old houses often contain secret compartments in desks and bookcases, places where important documents might be hidden from prying eyes." That evening, Miss Marple sat reviewing everything she had observed. The genealogical research, the questions about inheritance law, the furniture polish beneath the victim's nails, all pointed toward Miss Price discovering some long-buried secret about the Whitmore family. A secret significant enough that someone had spent weeks planning her murder, carefully timing it to coincide with the garden party's confusion while ensuring an innocent man would bear the blame. The pattern was becoming clearer, though several crucial elements remained frustratingly elusive. Those light, careful footsteps in rose garden clay continued to haunt her thoughts. The steps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. The village had settled into an uneasy rhythm following the inquest, like a disturbed ant-hill gradually resuming its normal patterns while remaining perpetually alert to further disruption. Inspector Slack's investigation continued with methodical determination, focusing increasingly upon Raymond Ashford, whose artistic temperament and documented quarrel with the deceased made him a satisfyingly obvious suspect. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very convenience of the case against him, a convenience that reminded her of other instances where the most apparent solution had proved to be carefully constructed misdirection. She was contemplating this concern while tending her roses when Mrs. Price Ridley appeared at the garden gate, her expression radiating the particular satisfaction that came from possessing information of considerable significance. The good lady's cheeks bore that telltale flush which indicated she had discovered something both shocking and delicious, the sort of revelation that would dominate tea, conversations for weeks to come. "My dear Miss Marple," she announced without preamble, "you'll never credit what I've learned from my cousin in Somerset. That woman, Miss Price, or whatever her real name was, She wasn't researching local history at all. She was a professional private inquiry agent, the sort who investigates family backgrounds for solicitors handling disputed estates. Miss Marple set down her gardening shears with careful deliberation, her pale blue eyes sharpening with interest. This revelation cast the entire matter in a dramatically different light, transforming what had appeared to be amateur blackmail into something far more systematic and dangerous. "How very illuminating," she murmured. "And did your cousin happen to mention who might have engaged her services?" "That's the extraordinary thing. She was apparently working independently, pursuing some private investigation of her own. My cousin's husband knows the firm she occasionally worked for, and they were quite surprised to learn she'd come to St. Mary Mead. Said she'd been making inquiries about the Whitmore family for months before she actually moved here." After Mrs. Price Ridley departed, Miss Marple walked thoughtfully toward the village center, where she encountered Miss Hartnell engaged in animated conversation with Mrs. Weatherby outside the post office. Their voices carried clearly in the still morning air, and Miss Marple paused ostensibly to examine the announcements posted on the church notice board. "I heard from Mrs. Finch's Daily Help," Miss Hartnell was saying with authority, "that the police found letters hidden in Miss Price's room. Not love letters, mind you, but correspondence signed J.W. Very mysterious, very pointed. References to old debts and family obligations." "J.W., Mrs. Weatherby repeated thoughtfully. "Could be anyone, really, though in this context." She left the implication hanging delicately in the air. Miss Marple absorbed this information while maintaining her appearance of casual interest in parish announcements. Professional investigation, mysterious correspondence, and systematic research into the Whitmore family history. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear, though several crucial elements remained frustratingly obscure. Her contemplation was interrupted by the appearance of Dolly Bantry, who approached with evident agitation. The young woman's usually cheerful demeanor had been replaced by worried distress, and her hands twisted nervously at her gloves as she spoke. "Miss Marple, I've been hoping to find you. Something rather disturbing has happened at Whitmore House. Julian is dismissing 2 of the indoor staff, Turner, who's been second footman for years, and little Alice from the pantry. He claims it's financial necessity, but the timing seems dreadfully suspicious. Perhaps there is genuine concern about expenses," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Old estates often find modern maintenance quite ruinously costly." Dolly shook her head emphatically. "Father spoke with Mr. Carstairs, who assured him that Julian's investments remain perfectly sound. Besides, Turner has been with the family since he was a boy. He knows every corner of that house. Dismissing him now, just after the murder, simply draws unwanted attention." "Unless," Miss Marple observed quietly, "Sir Julian wishes to remove someone whose intimate knowledge of the house might prove inconvenient. Servants often observe things their employers prefer to keep private." The implications of this possibility seemed to strike Dolly with considerable force. She stared at Miss Marple with dawning comprehension, then glanced nervously toward Whitmore House, its Georgian facade visible through the trees. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to Whitmore House under the pretext of offering condolences to Lady Isabella. She found her ladyship in the morning room, a charming space overlooking the gardens where the fatal party had occurred. The younger woman's composure appeared maintained through considerable effort rather than genuine calm, and her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. "Such a dreadful business," Lady Isabella murmured, her voice strained. "Julian has been absolutely distraught. He blames himself for not taking Miss Price's intrusions more seriously when they first began." "Intrusions?" Miss Marple inquired gently, accepting her delicate china cup. I had understood she was merely researching local history for some literary project. Lady Isabella's expression flickered with something that might have been relief or apprehension. Oh, she claimed that certainly, but her questions were far too specific, too pointed. She kept asking about Julian's grandfather, about property transfers in the 1880s, about whether any family documents had survived from that period. She paused, then added with evident reluctance. Julian finally told her quite firmly that she was becoming a nuisance. And how did she respond to such directness? She smiled, such an unpleasant, knowing smile, and said that truth had a way of emerging regardless of people's preferences. Julian was furious, though he controlled himself admirably. This was the day before the garden party. Miss Marple absorbed this crucial information while appearing to focus entirely on her tea. A professional investigator researching property fraud from the 1880s, making veiled threats about emerging truth, and maintaining systematic pressure on the Whitmore family. The motive was becoming increasingly apparent, though the identity of the murderer remained elusive. While Lady Isabella briefly excused herself to speak with the housekeeper, Miss Marple managed to slip into the library where the tragedy had occurred. The gallery railing had been expertly repaired, but the newer wood stood out clearly against the ancient oak. What captured her attention, however, was the massive Georgian writing desk positioned directly beneath the gallery. Its surface gleamed with fresh polish, but closer inspection revealed faint scratches around one of the decorative rosettes, marks entirely consistent with someone attempting to locate and open a concealed mechanism. Admiring the craftsmanship, Miss Marple, the quiet voice made her turn with carefully controlled surprise. Mr. Carstairs stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable but his eyes watchful. He had entered so silently she hadn't heard his approach, a fact that immediately brought those mysterious light footsteps back to mind. "Indeed, such beautiful work," she replied pleasantly, "though I notice this particular rosette appears slightly loose. Perhaps that's what caught poor Miss Price's attention during her final visit to this room." Carstairs' eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Miss Price was examining books in the gallery when she fell, Miss Marple. The police were quite clear about that." "Of course," she agreed mildly, though Dr. Haydock did mention finding furniture polish beneath her fingernails. Rather curious place to encounter it if one was merely handling leather-bound volumes. Wouldn't you agree? The solicitor's jaw tightened perceptibly. "I really couldn't speculate about such details. The authorities seem entirely satisfied with their conclusions regarding Mr. Ashford's guilt." "Oh yes, Inspector Slack does prefer solutions that present themselves with convenient clarity," Miss Marple observed. "But tell me, Mr. Carstairs, what continues to detain you in St. Mary Mead? Surely your legal business with Sir Julian concluded some time ago." "There are ongoing complications regarding the estate that require my continued attention," he replied carefully. "Complications involving inheritance law, perhaps. The very subject Miss Price had been researching with such determination." For a moment, genuine alarm flickered across Carstairs' composed features. "I'm not certain what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I would strongly suggest leaving such complex matters to qualified professionals." Walking home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. A professional investigator researching historical property fraud, systematic pressure involving the 1880s, destroyed documents, and nervous solicitors discussing inheritance complications. The pattern was unmistakable. Miss Price had discovered something that threatened the very foundation of the Whitmore family's claim to their estate, something significant enough that murder had seemed the only solution. The question that remained was not what had motivated the crime, but who possessed both the intimate knowledge of Whitmore House necessary to plan such an elaborate murder, and the desperate need to protect secrets that reached back through generations. Those careful, light footsteps in rose garden clay belonged to someone who moved through the house with perfect familiarity, yet wished to remain undetected. Someone whose very survival might depend on keeping the past safely buried. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple paused to consider the loose rosette on the Georgian's desk, the furniture polish beneath the victim's nails, and the ongoing fear that seemed to permeate Whitmore House despite Miss Price's death. The game was far from over, and she suspected the most dangerous moves were yet to come. The following morning brought developments that seemed to seal Raymond Ashford's fate, while simultaneously confirming Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the true nature of the crime. Turner, the dismissed footman, appeared at her cottage shortly after breakfast with the desperate air of a man who had exhausted conventional avenues and found himself forced to pursue the unconventional. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he began, twisting his cap between work-roughened hands. "But Mrs. Bantry suggested you might listen. I can't keep silent when an innocent man might hang for something he didn't do." Miss Marple invited him into her sitting room and poured tea with the calm efficiency that encouraged confidences. Turner's relief at finding a sympathetic audience was palpable as he described what he had witnessed the night before the garden party. "I was doing final rounds when I heard voices from the library," he explained. "Sir Julian and Mr. Carstairs were having what you might call a heated discussion. The door was slightly ajar, and I couldn't help but overhear. Mr. Carstairs was saying something about documents that couldn't be allowed to surface, that the Price woman had gotten too close to something that should have stayed buried." And Sir Julian's response? "He sounded frightened, miss. Truly frightened. Said if she'd found the original deed, everything was lost. The house, the title, everything his family had built for generations. Then Mr. Carstairs mentioned there being ways to handle such problems, that he'd dealt with similar situations before." Miss Marple's needles moved with thoughtful precision. "And you're certain of these exact words?" "As certain as I can be. What troubled me most was the next morning, preparing the library for the party. Someone had been at the old Georgian desk, the one beneath the gallery. Fresh scratches around the hidden compartment that only family and senior staff know about. It was open, miss, and whatever had been inside was gone." This revelation confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. The furniture polish beneath Miss Price's nails, the scratches on the rosette, the desperate conversation, all pointed to documents of devastating significance that the investigator had discovered or come dangerously close to finding. After Turner departed, Miss Marple received news from Dr. Haydock that Raymond Ashford had been formally arrested. Inspector Slack claimed to have found additional evidence, a notebook in Miss Price's handwriting containing references to R.A. and unpaid gambling debts, discovered hidden behind loose boards in Ashford's room at the vicarage. "How remarkably convenient," Miss Marple observed when the doctor shared this information. "Another piece of evidence appearing at precisely the right moment. Tell me, where exactly was this notebook discovered?" "In his rooms, hidden behind the skirting board. The vicar is devastated. Says he would have staked his life on the young man's innocence. And no doubt he would be correct to do so. This entire case has been too perfectly constructed, too neatly arranged with every piece of evidence pointing in exactly the same direction. Genuine crimes are far messier affairs, full of contradictions and inconsistencies. This has the hallmarks of careful stage management." Dr. Haydock settled into his chair with visible concern. "You're suggesting someone is deliberately framing Ashford?" "I'm suggesting that someone with considerable resources and intimate knowledge of both Whitmore House and village affairs has orchestrated this tragedy with remarkable precision. The weakened railing prepared weeks in advance, the saw planted among Ashford's supplies, and now this conveniently discovered notebook, all designed to ensure that when Miss Price died, suspicion would fall immediately upon someone entirely innocent." That afternoon brought an unexpected invitation to tea at Whitmore House. Sir Julian greeted her with forced heartiness, and they sat in the library where the murder had occurred. Miss Marple noticed that the loose rosette on the Georgian desk had been expertly repaired. "I wanted to thank you for your discretion during this difficult time," Sir Julian began. "The police seem confident the matter will be resolved with Ashford's arrest." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes wandering to the gallery above. "Though one wonders why a young man with no history of violence would choose such an elaborate method. Sawing through railings requires considerable planning." Sir Julian's smile tightened. "Desperation drives men to strange lengths. I understand he was being blackmailed." "So the police believe." Yet Miss Price's real interest seemed to lie in the past, specifically in matters of inheritance and property. "I recall you mentioning," she asked, "about your grandfather's papers." The silence that followed was heavy with unvoiced tension. Sir Julian set his cup down with careful precision. "My grandfather was a meticulous man. His papers are quite in order." "I'm sure they are," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Though sometimes papers can be too in order, can they not?" "Perfect. Records sometimes conceal imperfect realities." Walking home, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that had emerged with crystalline clarity. A professional investigator researching historical property fraud, missing documents from a hidden compartment, and evidence being planted with methodical precision to frame an innocent man. The killer felt safe now, believing their elaborate deception had succeeded. That confidence, Miss Marple decided, would prove to be their fatal mistake. The time for passive observation was ending. Tomorrow, she would begin setting a trap of her own. Miss Marple began her most dangerous gambit the following morning, armed with nothing more formidable than her knitting bag and an unshakable conviction that the truth, however carefully buried, always left traces for those patient enough to seek them. Her first destination was the offices of the Much Benham Chronicle, where decades of local records lay preserved in yellowed files that most people considered too tedious to examine. The elderly clerk, Mr. Pembridge, proved remarkably helpful when she explained her interest in property transfers during the 1880s, particularly those involving disputed inheritances. What she discovered among those dusty archives confirmed her darkest suspicions while providing the final piece of evidence she required. In 1883, the Whitmore estate had indeed changed hands under circumstances that were, even at the time, considered questionable. The original heir, Julian's great-grandfather, had died childless in India, leaving the succession in dispute between several distant cousins. The eventual winner of this legal battle had been one James Whitmore, whose claim had been supported by marriage certificates and birth records that established his legitimate descent from the family line. The newspaper accounts from that period, however, revealed something far more sinister. Two of the competing claimants had died under suspicious circumstances, one in a riding accident, another from sudden illness, before the matter could be properly adjudicated. James Whitmore's documents, while ultimately accepted by the courts, had been questioned by several legal experts who noted irregularities in the paper and ink that suggested more recent fabrication. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple murmured to herself, carefully noting the dates and details. Miss Price, with her professional expertise in genealogical fraud, would have recognized these inconsistencies immediately. More damaging still, she would have known exactly how to prove the document's fraudulent nature through modern investigative techniques unavailable to Victorian-era courts. Returning to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple made a strategic decision that would have alarmed anyone who truly understood its implications. She composed a brief note to Lady Isabella, requesting the pleasure of her company for tea that afternoon, and mentioning casually that she had made some interesting discoveries about the Whitmore family history during her research at the Chronicle offices. The message was designed to provoke exactly the kind of desperate response that would force the truth into the open. Lady Isabella arrived at the appointed hour, with the punctuality of someone who could not afford to appear reluctant, though her usual composed elegance showed distinct signs of strain. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted her teacup, and Miss Marple noticed that she wore different shoes than usual, sturdy walking boots rather than her customary delicate slippers, as though she had been expecting to traverse difficult terrain. "I do hope you won't think me presumptuous," Miss Marple began with deceptive mildness, "but I've been researching the fascinating history of local estates. The Whitmore succession, in particular, proved quite illuminating. Such a complex legal battle in 1883, with so many competing claimants and such convenient deaths among the opposition." Lady Isabella's composure cracked almost imperceptibly. I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about such ancient history, Miss Marple. Julian inherited his title quite legitimately. Oh, I'm certain he believes that entirely. Miss Marple agreed, her knitting needles moving with steady precision. The fraud was so expertly executed that it fooled everyone for generations. Until, of course, Miss Price arrived with her professional expertise in exactly such matters. She would have recognized the signs immediately, the irregularities in paper and ink that modern techniques can detect so easily. The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken confessions. Lady Isabella set down her cup with the careful control of someone fighting not to let their hands shake visibly. You see, Miss Marple continued conversationally, I've been puzzling over those footprints on the terrace, the light, careful steps in rose garden clay. They were made by someone who knew the house intimately, someone who could move through it without attracting attention, someone who understood exactly where to find the hidden compartment in that Georgian desk. The servants, Lady Isabella began desperately, were all accounted for during the crucial period, Miss Marple finished gently. No, those were the steps of someone who belonged in that house, someone who had legitimate reason to be there but needed to leave unseen after ensuring Miss Price would lean against that carefully weakened railing. Lady Isabella rose abruptly, her theatrical training finally asserting itself as she drew upon reserves of composure that had served her well on stage. This is all fascinating speculation, Miss Marple, but I'm afraid I must be going. Julian will be expecting me. Of course, my dear, though I should mention that Inspector Slack will be receiving my detailed report tomorrow morning, along with copies of the newspaper accounts and my observations about the physical evidence. I do hope Mr. Carstairs won't attempt anything foolish in the meantime. Men of his profession sometimes panic when their carefully constructed schemes begin to unravel. The words struck home with devastating accuracy. Lady Isabella's mask of composure finally shattered completely, revealing the desperate fear beneath. You don't understand, she whispered. Julian knew nothing. He inherited the title in perfect good faith. When Carstairs discovered the truth during routine legal work, he came to me privately. Said if the fraud became public, we would lose everything, the house, the income, our entire position in society. Miss Marple's needles paused in their steady rhythm. And he suggested that Miss Price's investigation could be redirected. It was meant to be an accident, Lady Isabella said, her voice breaking. We only intended to frighten her, to make her abandon her research, but when she found those documents in the hidden compartment, when she threatened to expose everything unless she received compensation for her silence, Carstairs said there was no choice. The confession hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Miss Marple regarded the younger woman with a mixture of pity and inexorable justice, understanding that the truth, once released, could never be contained again. And young Mr. Ashford? She asked quietly. Carstairs arranged everything, the planted evidence, the forged notebook entries. He said the boy's quarrel with Miss Price provided perfect cover, that no one would look beyond such an obvious suspect. Miss Marple set down her knitting with the finality of someone whose work was nearly complete. The trap had succeeded beyond her expectations, though the victory felt hollow in the face of such human weakness and waste. Tomorrow would bring justice, but tonight would bring only the bitter knowledge of how easily fear and greed could transform ordinary people into instruments of murder. The footsteps she had observed, those careful, guilty steps in rose garden clay, had led precisely where she had suspected from the beginning. Sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, the smallest details revealed the largest truths about the darkness that could lurk beneath the most respectable facades. The evening following Lady Isabella's tearful confession brought an atmosphere of barely contained crisis to St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself sensed that the careful facade of respectability was crumbling beyond repair. Miss Marple had anticipated that her afternoon's work would precipitate desperate action from those still hoping to escape justice, and she was not disappointed when Dr. Haydock appeared at her cottage shortly after 9 o'clock with news that confirmed her darkest expectations. "Carstairs has disappeared from the Blue Boar," he announced without preamble, settling into her sitting room with the weary air of a man who had witnessed too much human frailty in recent days. "Left suddenly after receiving what the landlord described as an urgent telephone call, packed his belongings in great haste, and departed without settling his account, most unlike a solicitor of his supposed reputation." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, though her pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. How very illuminating. And did this telephone call occur before or after Lady Isabella's visit to Inspector Slack this afternoon? Just after, as it happens. Word travels quickly in a village, even official word. I suspect someone felt compelled to warn Mr. Carstairs that his carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel. The implications of Carstairs' flight were immediately apparent to Miss Marple, who understood that desperate men rarely fled without attempting to eliminate the evidence of their crimes. Lady Isabella's confession had been detailed enough to implicate the solicitor thoroughly, but without corroborating proof, a clever lawyer might yet escape justice by claiming she was a hysterical woman attempting to shift blame for her own actions. "I believe," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that Mr. Carstairs will not travel far without first attempting to retrieve certain documents that could prove inconvenient to him. Men of his profession are methodical by nature. They rarely leave loose ends untied when their freedom depends upon thoroughness." Her prediction proved accurate when Turner, the dismissed footman, appeared at her door near midnight with information that confirmed her suspicions. He had been keeping watch on Whitmore House from a sense of loyalty to Sir Julian, and had observed a figure moving through the library with a shaded lantern, systematically searching the room where Miss Price had died. "Moving like someone who knew the house well," Turner reported breathlessly. "Went straight to that Georgian desk and spent considerable time examining the hidden compartment. When he finished, he had a bundle of papers that he fed into the fireplace one by one." Miss Marple rose with surprising alacrity for a woman of her years. "Dr. Haydock, I believe we must interrupt Mr. Carstairs' document destruction before he completes his work. Some evidence, once destroyed, can never be recovered." They found Whitmore House in darkness, save for the flickering glow from the library windows, where Carstairs was indeed engaged in systematic destruction of what appeared to be legal documents dating from the 1880s. He worked with methodical efficiency, examining each paper carefully before consigning it to the flames, his face illuminated by the orange light in a way that emphasized the calculating coldness of his expression. Miss Marple positioned herself in the doorway with quiet authority, while Dr. Haydock moved to block the French windows. Carstairs looked up from his work with the startled expression of a man caught in an act he had believed entirely private. "Mr. Carstairs," Miss Marple observed mildly, "such dedication to your work is admirable, though I cannot help but wonder why legal documents require destruction at such an unusual hour." The solicitor's composure recovered quickly, his professional mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, what an unexpected pleasure. I was merely disposing of some outdated papers at Sir Julian's request. Family documents of no current relevance, including the original 1883 inheritance documents that prove James Whitmore's fraudulent claim to the estate," Miss Marple inquired pleasantly. "The papers that Miss Price discovered in that very desk, leading to her unfortunate encounter with the weakened gallery railing." The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken confessions. Carstairs' eyes flickered toward the French windows, calculating distances and possibilities, but Dr. Haydock's solid presence eliminated any hope of escape through that route. "Lady Isabella has been most forthcoming about the events leading to Miss Price's death," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "She described in considerable detail how you encouraged her fears about social ruin, how you prepared the murder weapon weeks in advance, and how you arranged for young Mr. Ashford to bear the blame through planted evidence. The ravings of a hysterical woman, Carstairs replied, though his voice lacked conviction. She killed Miss Price in a moment of panic and now seeks to implicate others in her crime. Perhaps, Miss Marple allowed, though the physical evidence tells a rather different story. Those careful footprints in rose garden clay, for instance, too light for a man of your build, yet too deliberate for genuine panic. And the saw found among Mr. Ashford's belongings bore no trace of the wood dust one would expect from actual use, suggesting it was planted there, unused. Dr. Haydock moved closer, his medical bag in hand and his expression grim. The police are already en route, Carstairs. Miss Marple sent word before we came here. Your only choice now is whether to face justice with whatever dignity you can muster, or to compound your crimes with further desperate actions. The sound of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance, their engines cutting through the night silence with inexorable authority. Carstairs looked from the burning documents to the blocked exits, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him like a house of cards in a strong wind. "You cannot prove anything," he said finally, though his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who no longer believed his own words. "Circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a confessed murderess, hardly sufficient for conviction." Miss Marple smiled with the gentle implacability that had unraveled so many carefully planned deceptions over the years. "On the contrary, Mr. Carstairs, we have considerably more than that. But I believe Inspector Slack will be delighted to explain the full extent of the evidence when he arrives. Some secrets, you see, are simply too large to remain buried forever, no matter how many people die to protect them." As the police cars drew nearer, their headlights sweeping across the manor's facade, Miss Marple reflected that justice, however delayed, possessed its own inexorable momentum. The footsteps that no one should have heard had finally led to their inevitable destination, not away from justice, but directly toward it. Inspector Slack arrived at Whitmore House with the grim satisfaction of a man whose evening had taken an unexpectedly productive turn, though his usual bluster was tempered by the magnitude of what Miss Marple's investigation had uncovered. The library, scene of both murder and attempted evidence destruction, became an impromptu courtroom as uniformed constables methodically extinguished the fire and began retrieving half-burned documents with metal tongs. The acrid smell of charred paper mingled with the lingering scent of roses from the garden, creating an atmosphere both elegant and ominous. The documentary. Evidence. Carstairs stood beside the Georgian desk with his hands formally secured behind his back, his professional composure cracking like ice under spring sun. The papers he had been so desperately trying to destroy proved devastating to any remaining pretense of innocence. Sergeant Lake carefully examined the rescued documents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he catalogued their contents. "What we have here, sir," he reported to Inspector Slack, "are the original fraudulent inheritance records from 1883, correspondence between the defendant and Lady Isabella detailing their conspiracy. And, most damning of all, a letter in Carstairs' own handwriting outlining the plan to weaken the gallery railing and arrange circumstances for Miss Price's death during the garden party." Miss Marple observed quietly from the doorway, her knitting bag clutched in her hands. "Lawyers are trained to document everything thoroughly," she remarked to Dr. Haydock. "Sometimes that very meticulousness becomes their undoing. Mr. Carstairs simply could not resist keeping records of his own cleverness, a fatal flaw in a man planning murder." The confrontation. "Now then," Inspector Slack began, his notebook open and pencil poised, "let's have this set out clearly and in proper order. You were discovered destroying family papers at midnight, immediately after your name was mentioned in connection with murder. You fled your lodgings without paying your bill, and we already have evidence you lied about your dealings with the deceased. The situation appears rather unfavorable. Wouldn't you agree?" Carstairs remained silent, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. But Miss Marple stepped forward with the gentle authority that had unraveled so many carefully constructed deceptions over the years. "Perhaps I might explain how the pieces fit together, Inspector," she said mildly. "You will, of course, verify every particular independently, but the pattern is quite clear once one understands the true nature of Miss Price's investigation." Inspector Slack made a sound that could generously be interpreted as agreement. "If you must, Miss Marple. But stick to facts, if you please." Miss Marple's revelation. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting bag, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone who had thought through every detail with mathematical precision. The essence is quite simple, though the execution was fiendishly complex. Miss Price, whose real name was Lavinia Trent, was a professional genealogical investigator specializing in inheritance fraud. She had been researching the Whitmore succession for months before her arrival in St. Mary Mead, convinced that the 1883 inheritance was secured through fraudulent documents. She glanced toward Sir Julian, whose face had gone ashen. "Your great-grandfather inherited this estate on the strength of papers that were, I'm afraid, expertly forged. 2 rival claimants died under suspicious circumstances before they could press their legitimate cases. Miss Trent, with modern investigative techniques at her disposal, recognized the telltale signs of document fabrication that Victorian courts had missed." "Mere speculation," Carstairs interjected, though his voice lacked conviction. "On the contrary," Miss Marple continued serenely, "the proof lay precisely where any anxious Victorian gentleman would have hidden it, in the secret compartment of this Georgian desk. James Whitmore, though successful in court, evidently retained the genuine documents or other compromising evidence, concealing them for possible future use. Miss Trent, experienced in such matters, located the hidden mechanism. The furniture polish beneath her fingernails testified that she had been searching there shortly before her death." The method revealed. Miss Marple moved closer to the desk, her pale blue eyes sharp with purpose. "Mr. Carstairs here, engaged to review the estate's legal standing, stumbled upon the same irregularities during his routine work. He realized that Miss Trent's investigation threatened not only the Whitmore claim, but also his own professional reputation, possibly his freedom if his complicity in concealing the fraud became known. The solicitor's control slipped visibly. I acted on information provided to me. Like any professional, I cannot be held responsible for crimes committed generations ago." "Indeed not," Miss Marple agreed. "But you can be held responsible for murder committed last Tuesday afternoon. You see, Inspector, Mr. Carstairs spent weeks preparing. The gallery railing, sawing through the supports with surgical precision and concealing the damage with wood stain and putty. The carpenter's report confirms this was meticulous work, requiring intimate knowledge of the house's construction." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "And the timing?" "Perfectly calculated. During the garden party, when the house was full of potential witnesses but everyone was distracted by outdoor activities, Mr. Carstairs lured Miss Trent to the gallery with some pretext, perhaps a particular book relevant to her research. When she leaned against the railing to examine something below, it gave way exactly as he had planned. Lady Isabella's downfall. At that moment, Lady Isabella appeared in the doorway, hastily dressed and trembling with barely controlled emotion. Her theatrical composure had finally abandoned her entirely, leaving only a frightened woman facing the consequences of her choices. "I heard voices," she said weakly. "Julian sent for me. Is it over?" Inspector Slack's expression was implacable. "Lady Isabella Whitmore, I am arresting you as an accessory to murder and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice." The formal words seemed to break whatever remained of her defenses. She collapsed into a chair with a sob that echoed through the elegant room. "I never meant for anyone to die," she whispered. "Carstairs said it would appear as an accident, that the investigation would conclude quickly and our lives could continue undisturbed. I was such a fool." The physical evidence. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the retrieved documents, looked up with professional gravity. "The forensic evidence supports Miss Marple's reconstruction entirely." We found rose garden clay on Lady Isabella's walking boots, the same distinctive clay that created those light footprints on the terrace. There's also a fragment of blue fabric caught on the gallery railing's deliberately roughened edge, matching the dress she wore to the garden party. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Those careful footprints troubled me from the beginning. Too light for a man, yet too deliberate for genuine panic. Lady Isabella had been present when the railing was weakened, ensuring it would collapse under Miss Trent's weight. Afterward, overcome by guilt and horror, she returned to look into the library, then fled toward the servants' entrance, walking on tiptoe to avoid detection. Justice for the innocent. The following morning brought Raymond Ashford's release from custody, though the young man's ordeal had left visible marks on his artistic temperament. He appeared at Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon, his gratitude evident, but his faith in human nature clearly shaken. "I cannot adequately express my thanks," he said, accepting tea with hands that still trembled slightly. "Inspector Slack informed me that without your observations and persistence I would almost certainly have been convicted. The evidence against me seemed overwhelming." Miss Marple poured tea with her customary calm efficiency. "The evidence was designed to appear overwhelming, Mr. Ashford. That was precisely what made it suspect. Genuine crimes are messy, contradictory affairs full of loose ends and inconsistencies. This case was too perfect, too neatly arranged, the work of someone with legal training who understood exactly how investigations proceed." The bitter truth. Sir Julian's reaction to the revelations proved genuinely tragic, the complete bewilderment of a man who had inherited both title and guilt without understanding either. He stood in his library, staring at the repaired gallery railing, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I believed about my family, my position, my very identity, all of it built on lies and fraud, and now murder added to the tally." He turned to Miss Marple with haunted eyes. "What becomes of a man when he discovers his entire life has been a deception?" "You rebuild, Sir Julian," Miss Marple replied gently. "You face the truth with whatever dignity you can muster and create something honest from the ruins. Your ancestors' crimes need not define your character, though they will certainly affect your circumstances." The final reckoning. As the police completed their work and the principals in the tragedy faced their various fates, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of the case. The footsteps that no one should have heard had led inexorably to justice, but that justice carried a bitter taste. Carstairs and Lady Isabella would face trial for murder, while Sir Julian would likely lose both title and estate to the legitimate heirs, whoever they might prove to be. The original James Whitmore's fraud had poisoned 3 generations, creating a chain of consequences that stretched across nearly 50 years. Miss Price's death had been the inevitable result of secrets too dangerous to remain buried and too valuable to abandon willingly. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple considered the eternal human capacity for self-deception and the terrible price that others so often paid for individual moral failures. The village would return to its quiet routines, but the scandal of the Whitmore inheritance would provide conversation for years to come, a reminder that even the most respectable facades could conceal the darkest secrets. Those light, careful footsteps in rose garden clay had finally fallen silent, but their echo would linger long after the last of the evidence had been filed away and the guilty had faced their punishment. In St. Mary Mead, as everywhere else, human nature continued its endless, fascinating dance between good and evil, and Miss Marple would be there to observe it, armed with nothing more formidable than her knitting needles and her unshakable understanding of the human heart. The trial at the Old Bailey commanded national attention, transforming St. Mary Mead's quiet tragedy into a sensation that filled newspapers across Britain. Miss Marple attended only the opening proceedings, finding the theatrical atmosphere distasteful despite her crucial role in bringing the conspirators to justice. The prosecution presented their case with devastating thoroughness. the fraudulent inheritance documents from 1883, Carstairs' meticulous correspondence detailing the murder's planning, and the physical evidence of rose garden clay on Lady Isabella's boots created an overwhelming narrative of premeditated crime. Raymond Ashford testified with quiet dignity about the planted evidence that had nearly destroyed him, while Dr. Haydock's medical testimony established the precise mechanics of Miss Price's death and the furniture polish beneath her fingernails that proved her final search of the desk's hidden compartment. Turner's account of the overheard conspiracy between Sir Julian and Carstairs provided crucial evidence of premeditation, his loyalty to the Whitmore family making his testimony particularly powerful. The verdict surprised no one who had followed the proceedings. Lady Isabella received life imprisonment, her theatrical career ending in a cell rather than on the stage she had once graced. Carstairs was sentenced to hang, later commuted to life imprisonment. Neither sentence seemed adequate to those who had known Miss Price, but justice had been served in its imperfect, earthly form. The most extraordinary development emerged during the legal resolution of the inheritance fraud. Investigators traced the legitimate bloodline through the female descent, the sister of the man who had died childless in India. The rightful owner proved to be a young schoolteacher living modestly in Devon, completely unaware of her connection to the family and struggling to make ends meet. Justice, it seemed, possessed its own sense of poetic balance. A poor woman would suddenly find herself mistress of a great estate, while those who had clung to it through fraud lost everything. Sir Julian's departure from St. Mary Mead came on a crisp autumn morning, his modest suitcase a stark contrast to the grandeur he was leaving behind. He paused at Miss Marple's garden gate with the hesitant air of a man uncertain whether his presence would be welcome. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "they tell me that by the time the legal processes conclude, Whitmore House will no longer be mine. The Canadian cousin stands to inherit, descendant of one of those original claimants from 1883. "Quite proper," Miss Marple replied gently, inviting him in for tea, "though terribly hard on you personally. Injustice in one generation rarely resolves itself without some measure of pain in another." He considered this with weary gravity. "People keep telling me I'm not to blame, that I inherited the fraud unknowingly. But it was my signature on those letters authorizing Carstairs to handle the matter quietly. I agreed to the concealment, even if not to the murder. You stood at a crossroads and chose the wrong path," Miss Marple acknowledged. "But when confronted with the full extent of what had been done in your name, you did not persist in falsehood. There is some moral weight in that, at least." As he departed for the station, the lane seemed curiously empty without the shadow of Whitmore House looming over village affairs. Yet St. Mary Mead possessed remarkable resilience. It absorbed the shock, adjusted its patterns, and gradually returned to something approaching normalcy, though never quite the same as before. Whitmore House passed to its new owners, pleasant but unremarkable people with no connection to the village's social fabric. They hired new staff, redecorated the principal rooms, and hosted no garden parties that first year, preferring to let the house's troubled history fade gradually into the past. Miss Marple observed these changes with philosophical acceptance. The case had revealed uncomfortable truths about how easily fear and greed could transform respectable people into murderers, how long-buried secrets could poison multiple generations, and how the appearance of propriety could conceal the darkest moral corruption. These were lessons she had learned many times before, but each new instance added depth to her understanding of human nature's infinite capacity for both good and evil. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple returned to her knitting and her quiet observation of village life. The footsteps that no one should have heard had finally fallen silent, but their echo would remain in the collective memory of everyone who had witnessed the tragedy unfold. Some secrets were simply too large to remain buried forever, and some crimes too carefully planned to escape the notice of those patient enough to observe the small revealing details that others overlooked. Justice had been served, though imperfectly and at considerable cost. The guilty had been punished, the innocent vindicated, and the truth, however painful, had emerged into the unforgiving light of day. In Miss Marple's long experience, that was perhaps the most that could reasonably be expected from an imperfect world populated by flawed human beings struggling between their better angels and their darker impulses. Human nature, she reflected, remained remarkably consistent. People lied for the same old reasons: fear, pride, money, love. And occasionally, when circumstances became tangled enough, those same people created situations that required an elderly spinster with sharp eyes and a long memory to set things right again. Someone was always watching, and sooner or later, someone understood. Spring arrived in St. Mary Mead with the quiet determination of something that had weathered worse seasons and expected to endure many more. Miss Marple sat in her garden, knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a baby jacket for the butcher's new grandchild, when Raymond West appeared at her gate with the purposeful air of a nephew seeking both reassurance and literary inspiration. "The whole affair has the elements of Greek tragedy," Raymond declared, settling into a wicker chair beneath the ancient cedar. "The ancestral sin visiting ruin upon descendants, the hubris of thinking murder, could be disguised as accident. You played both chorus and oracle, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple smoothed her wool with gentle precision. "You always were fond of dramatic metaphors, dear. But truly, it was merely Mrs. Pork's missing sovereign all over again. Do you remember that incident from 20 years past? Her daughter took the money, then spent days loudly proclaiming her terror of burglars, locking doors that were never locked, checking windows always left open. The excess of performance betrayed her, just as it did Lady Isabella. Innocent people," she continued thoughtfully, "do not constantly advertise their innocence. Lady Isabella was an actress treating murder as a role. She played the distressed chatelaine skillfully, but when she came for tea that afternoon, her fear was genuine while her surprise at my revelations was entirely manufactured. She knew exactly what I would say before I said it. The trouble with rehearsed performances is they lack the chaotic rhythm of genuine life." Raymond leaned forward with interest. "The footsteps you mentioned, the ones no one should have heard." Physical footsteps in clay were important evidence, certainly, but the psychological footsteps were far louder. The most dangerous movements in any house are not those made by intruders, but the quiet, familiar steps of those who belong there. Lady Isabella and Mr. Carstairs moved through Whitmore House with the confidence of ownership, feeling entitled to their crime because they were respectable people who believed moral rules applied only to others. The village had adapted with remarkable resilience to its transformed circumstances. The new owners of Whitmore House, the legitimate heirs whose Devon school teacher had inherited an estate she never knew existed, proved pleasant if unremarkable people, who retained most existing staff and hosted garden parties with genuine warmth rather than performed elegance. Turner, the former footman whose loyalty had helped expose the conspiracy, now owned a partnership in a much Benham garage where his practical skills and steady temperament flourished. Raymond Ashford had returned to London, his writing transformed by his brush with wrongful conviction from satirical observations about upper-class decadence to deeper explorations of justice and moral compromise. His letters to the vicar described a novel that would likely puzzle his publishers, but possessed the authentic weight that purely intellectual observation could never achieve. "Sir Julian has written," Miss Marple said, producing a cream envelope from her knitting bag. "He's settled in a Cotswolds cottage, taken up gardening, and is writing truthful local history. He sounds relieved. The weight of that great fraudulent house has been lifted from his shoulders. He was walking in shoes that never fitted. Now he can go barefoot if he chooses." The community itself had undergone subtle but significant transformation. Mrs. Price Ridley's admission at the Women's Institute that they had all too readily abandoned Christian charity for convenient conclusions represented the kind of moral reckoning that distinguished genuine community from mere geographical proximity. St. Mary Mead had confronted uncomfortable truths about its capacity for rushing to judgment and allowing social position to obscure moral clarity. The police still believe forensic evidence solved the case, Raymond observed. The clay, the saw, the documents. Police excel at dealing with things, Miss Marple replied, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm. They measure and photograph with great precision, but often forget that crimes are committed by people, creatures of habit and character. If you understand that Mrs. Price Ridley will always cheat slightly at bridge or that the postman reads postcards before delivering them, you understand human nature's fundamental truths. Murder is simply that same nature, writ large and violent. As evening shadows lengthened across the garden, Miss Marple reflected on justice's peculiar nature and its aftermath. The guilty had been punished, the innocent vindicated, and the community had learned valuable lessons about accepting convenient narratives without questioning their foundations. Those light, careful footsteps in rose garden clay had led inexorably to truth, though the journey had exacted its price from everyone involved. "The village never slumbers, Raymond," she said gently, packing away her wool. "It watches, listens, and remembers. Evil may walk with soft footsteps, trying to pass unheard, but in St. Mary Mead, someone is always listening. That is the great safety of small places. We all know the sound of each other's tread." Standing to brush a stray petal from her skirt, Miss Marple considered the eternal human capacity for both self-deception and redemption. The footsteps that no one should have heard had finally fallen silent, but their echo would linger as a reminder that justice, however delayed or imperfect, possessed its own inexorable momentum. "Now come inside, dear," she said with characteristic practicality. "I believe there's seed cake for tea, and we've talked enough of murder for one afternoon." Human nature, she knew, would continue its endless, fascinating dance between light and shadow, and she would be there to observe it with knitting needles and unshakable understanding of the human heart. Autumn settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle authority of a season that understood both endings and beginnings, transforming the village into a watercolor study of amber light and lengthening shadows. The Harvest Festival at Whitmore House provided the perfect occasion for what Mrs. Bantry privately called the restoration of normality, though everyone understood that normality, once fractured by murder, could never be perfectly reassembled. Miss Marple positioned herself beneath the ancient oak where she had first observed those fateful garden party proceedings, her knitting needles working steadily on a warm scarf for the approaching winter. The atmosphere bore no resemblance to that tense afternoon when death had stalked among the tea tables. Children ran laughing across lawns where terrified guests had once huddled, and the air rang with honest celebration rather than whispered conspiracy. The village had healed through its traditional mechanisms of gossip, reflection, and gradual acceptance, though the process had left everyone subtly changed. Mrs. Price Ridley still dominated the baking competitions with fierce determination, but her pronouncements carried newfound caution. She had learned that respectability provided no immunity from moral failure. Dolly Bantry had emerged from her romantic disillusionment with unexpected maturity, her infatuation with the tragic Sir Julian replaced by practical plans for nurses' training. She now organized village events with a competence that suggested future leadership qualities. Miss Eleanor Rowe, the Devon school teacher who had inherited an estate she never knew existed, proved a revelation in her unpretentious warmth. She walked with what Miss Marple approvingly noted was an honest tread, no stealth, no careful tiptoeing, no need to muffle the sound of her presence. Under her guidance, Whitmore House had shed its atmosphere of guilty secrets, becoming simply a home where children were welcome and laughter echoed freely through rooms that had harbored too many whispered conspiracies. "I've established a scholarship fund in Miss Trent's memory," Miss Rowe had written in her recent letter to Miss Marple. "For students researching historical injustices, it seems appropriate that the estate built on fraud should now support the pursuit of truth. She died seeking justice. Perhaps her work can continue through others." This gesture exemplified the kind of redemption Miss Marple found most satisfying, not the magical erasure of past wrongs, but the conscious choice to transform tragedy into constructive action. The scholarship would ensure that Lavinia Trent's professional dedication to exposing genealogical fraud would outlive her murderers, creating something positive from the wreckage of human weakness and fear. Dr. Haydock joined her beneath the oak, settling with the comfortable familiarity of long friendship. "The patient has recovered, I believe," he observed, gesturing toward the cheerful festivities. "Though I suspect you would say the underlying condition remains chronic." "Human nature is indeed a chronic condition, Doctor," Miss Marple agreed, her needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "We have excised the immediate malignancy, Mr. Carstairs with his terrible ambition, Lady Isabella with her desperate fear, but the susceptibility remains. Evil is not an invasion from outside, it is ordinary weakness allowed to grow in darkness. The small lie that requires a larger one, the minor greed that becomes consuming hunger. It is terribly, frighteningly domestic." She paused to examine her work, then continued thoughtfully. "People believe that respectability provides protection from moral corruption, but respectability is merely performance. The most dangerous footsteps are always the quietest ones, made by those who believe their social position entitles them to walk where others cannot tread." The vicar approached with his characteristic gentle shuffle, carrying tea in the satisfied expression of a man whose congregation had learned valuable lessons about rushing to judgment. "I keep thinking about those documents," he said, settling beside them. "Generations of lies, all to preserve an inheritance that ultimately meant nothing when truth emerged. Pride, Miss Marple. Surely the deadliest sin because it convinces us that ordinary rules don't apply to extraordinary people." As evening shadows lengthened across the grounds, Miss Marple reflected on justice's imperfect but inexorable nature. The guilty had faced punishment, the innocent had been vindicated, and the community had confronted uncomfortable truths about its capacity for accepting convenient narratives without proper scrutiny. St. Mary Mead would remember this affair for generations, the cautionary tale growing richer with each retelling. The footsteps that no one should have heard had finally fallen silent, but their echo would linger as permanent reminder that in small villages, where everyone knew everyone else's business, evil could never walk entirely unobserved. Someone was always watching, always listening, always remembering the small inconsistencies that revealed larger truths about human nature's eternal struggle between light and shadow. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple paused at her cottage gate to admire the evening primroses opening in the twilight. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new puzzles in human behavior, new opportunities to apply her lifetime's accumulated wisdom. But tonight, she would simply enjoy her garden's peaceful beauty and the satisfaction of knowing that justice, however delayed, had ultimately prevailed. In St. Mary Mead, as everywhere else, the dance between good and evil continued its eternal cycle, and Miss Jane Marple would be there to observe it with sharp eyes, knitting needles, and unshakable understanding of the human heart's capacity for both darkness and unexpected redemption.